My name is Gustav Herr. I am a 75-year-old man and a proud grandfather. Kurt, my eldest grandson, is quite the writer, having taken an interest in some old Stephen King books I bought for his father many years ago. He's a quiet kid, good-natured, but very shy, and naturally, he's lacking in acquaintances. So I was overjoyed to hear that he found an online community of like-minded souls to share his writing with. However, one night last night, he came to me with one of those spooky pasta things set during the Vietnam War, and innocently suggested I might like it, given my penchant for military history. The only Vietnam story I've never told. Bullshit, I thought, and sat down at my kitchen table to read it. It was never something I'd normally have any interest in reading, but I do like to show an interest in my grandson's hobbies. I put on my reading glasses, giving a skeptical chuckle as I peered at the computer screen and began. Once I'd finished, I stood up, poured myself a drink, and felt myself tremble as the bitter liquid passed my lips. The shuddering didn't cease. I watched as my left hand shook in a way I hadn't done in 47 years. The darkness outside my kitchen window seemed to hum with foreboding. Not since I was a young man had it seemed like such a cloak of shadows, a black veil concealing hideous fates. I'm about to tell you something only my wife knows. Something I've never properly told my own son. Something if my grandson knew, would probably have him never showing me that story. I spent 25 years in the CIA's Special Activities Division. 2 of those years were spent in Vietnam and neighboring Laos. What was mistaken as fiction by my grandson, I knew to be the truth. A truth that was the reason I'd suffered from night terrors all my adult life. Fits of cold sweats and balled fists in the early hours of the morning. I knew it to be the cause of all these North Korean underground nuclear tests. The pariah state possibly being the only thing standing in the way of complete human extinction. But I can't find a way to tell my grandson. I just can't. So, I'm telling you. I was 22 when I first landed in Saigon, barely a grown man. Before that, I'd never even left Massachusetts. Boston's Little Italy was the most exotic place in the world to me. Feeling like Neil Armstrong landing on an alien planet. The humidity that hit me in the face as I stepped off the airplane was unbelievable. How people could live in that heat, I couldn't imagine. But live they did. In tiny, arterial streets and wide, sunflower-lined avenues, millions upon millions of Vietnamese made their way around the city on little mopeds and scooters. My cigarette-smoking taxi driver filled the car with thick, billowing fumes, beeping the horn so regularly that it could have been Morse code. I recoiled when he began bellowing viciously out the window in Vietnamese at any two-wheelers that came in too close. It was a sensory overload. Alien sights and unfamiliar noises, exotic scents, and both that were putrid and pleasurable. It was almost a relief to arrive at the air-conditioned Saigon Hilton. I quickly lost my innocence. The agency field guys I was posted with had developed a taste for Vietnamese food. Loud, vibrant flavors in some strangely familiar forms. Vietnamese beer was pretty popular too. Weak enough to drink with lunch, but strong enough to bring on that numbing sensation for a tedious, hot afternoon of talking in circles with South Vietnamese intelligent officers. Yet, it was the night that brought Saigon to life. Neon signs and blaring speakers from shrines and temples. Vietnamese go-go dancers, gyrating to lyrics they couldn't understand. Fried meat and incense filling the air with sweet, delicious smells. street vendors sold fruits that looked like props from a science fiction movie. My first kill was a Viet Cong assassin that had already done away with a handful of South Vietnamese army soldiers. We knew that he was experienced. He was hardened, possibly trained by the KGB. One of the officers was killed in his sleep, the assailant having infiltrated the man's well-guarded residence completely undetected. They were a specter, a shadow. Their reputation sent chills through me. Yet, as the infamous enemy cutthroat parked up their scooter and slid off a helmet, I saw the silky, black and dainty features of a beautiful young woman.
Fire!
The order was cold. The trigger was pulled, and after the 7/0 62mm bullet smashed through her skull, she violently hit the concrete below her with a sickening thud. All I could think about, in the hour or so that followed, was the recent photograph of the Kent State student lying dead on the tarmac back home, also from American bullets. That was Christmas of 1970. I spent New Year's Eve with the man who gave me the order. "Just don't think about it. Relax. Take a load off. You've been working hard," Stanley said, shrugging it off like we worked in sales before swinging at the neck of a beer bottle. He couldn't have been much older than 30, but the graying hair around his temples gave him a wizened look. "This is war, Gus. Just like our fathers fought. This shit happens and the enemy doesn't always look like you imagined him to." He tossed up a few notes onto the bar top, rising from his stool and beckoning me to follow. "Now, I got a story for you," he said, lighting up a smoke with the remains of his previous. "I worked an assignment up near Da Nang a few years back. Real dinky-daw shit. Few Marines went missing in the jungle near Lo Tran. Rescue mission got chewed up. The survivors went nuts. It was a real mess. My point is, sometimes in the line of work, you hear and see things that, well, you can't really explain, not by rational means. They're trying things that you gotta worry about. Not some gook bitch lying dead on the side of the fucking noodle shop. She's not our problem anymore. She's God's fucking problem now." He laughed at this, at his own sick joke, and in the moment, I hated him. He walked me down a little alleyway that led off from a bustling marketplace, a lone beggar crying out pathetically as he pointed to the stumps that he used to be his legs. The sounds of bartering dying down as we slinked into the darkness. It was almost pitch black when we reached a small doorway, Stanley knocking gently on the door before it creaked open. 3 or 4 scantily clad Vietnamese girls lounged out around a waiting room, smiling and greeting us as we entered. It was a brothel. "Stanley, this isn't my scene," I stammered at him, shaking my head and raising my hands in a mocking surrender. "Oh, I know, kid, but Mama-san here is going to give you something different tonight." He grinned, saying something in Vietnamese to one of the older women who immediately dragged me off to a small, dimly lit room. I was too tired and drunk to protest, but when she gestured to a large pipe, I knew it wasn't carnal pleasure she had in mind. As she brought the pipe to my lips and I inhaled the thick, potent opium smoke, I felt all my anxieties float away with the subsequent exhalation. It was euphoric oblivion. My mind observed the pretty, Eastern features of the dead assassin. She told me everything is as it should be, and that one day I will be lost to the world just as she was. I heard her words and was only struck by how uncaring I was, how chemically incapable of emotion I was in that moment. That's how I spent the early hours of New Year's Day, 1971. I killed twice more during my time in Saigon, and each time I visited the little opium den near the marketplace. After a while, I began to go there just to kill the boredom. The Tet Offensive had broken the back of the Viet Cong long before I'd even arrived in country, and there was a little to do for a jaded assassin such as myself. All the action was up near the border, raids into North Vietnamese territory to blow up railway or mark targets for B-52s to rain pure hatred and discontent onto. Plenty of humid, fuzzy Saigon nights were spent lying on the filthy mattresses in that dark, dingy opium den, trying to smoke away the ghostly faces of the people I'd murdered. My colleagues began to look concerned at lunch meetings, clearly perturbed by my pale, clammy appearance. I brushed off their probing inquiries with half-assed lies about bad street food and stomach flu, but I knew I had to quit. By the end of my second opium-free night, I had to put my service pistol in my mouth and carcass the steel of the trigger tenderly with the pad of my index finger. The air conditioning that kept it cool, the barrel leaving a metallic taste in my mouth as I closed my eyes and prepared for oblivion. But I didn't give in to it. I'm glad to this day that I didn't give in. I sweated out the opiates, vomiting into a bucket and trembling under the hypnotic rotation of the ceiling fan. I felt like I was going to die. You know the feeling of your foot falling asleep? Well, imagine that over your entire body, as if 100,000 red-hot needles are just boring under your flesh. It was a living nightmare. Yet as the withdrawal syndromes wore off and I began to feel like a human being again, I prayed for a mission, a purpose, something to serve as a distraction from the nightmarish reality of my existence in Saigon. My prayers were swiftly answered. On the evening of March 11th, 1971, we flew up towards Da Nang with a small team of Green Berets. The grizzled, elite Special Forces soldiers viewed us with suspicion and disgust, barely returning Stanley's overfamiliar greetings. He kept me in the dark for most of the trip, answering questions vaguely, giving away nothing of interest. When I finally showed some visible signs of frustration, he relented, laughing to himself that he'd managed to provoke a reaction. "It's top secret," he grinned. "You'll see when we hit the LZ. Top secret CIA mission, and fucking Vietnam great. Just fucking great," I replied, having to shout over the din of Chinook's powerful engines. "Vietnam?" he laughed again. "Oh, it's not in Vietnam, buddy." At that, the helicopter's lights flickered off and the aircraft itself made a powerful turn to the west. I had to cling on the interior to keep from bowling over in my seat, watching as Stanley's face remained carved in an almost bloodthirsty grin as the red, emergency lighting glowed on. Out of the small porthole window, I could see the darkness of the jungle canopy just below us. A great, shadowy mass, glinting as the moonlight reflected off the leaves. We had evidently descended in altitude by a great deal, surely for the purposes of evading radar. After a few hours, we began our descent onto the jungle landing zone, freshly carved out from the bush not long before by a long-ranged patrol unit. Barbed wire surrounded the perimeter, sandbag machine gun posts dotted the clearing, and small operations tents had been hastily erected. As we entered, I studied the maps on the wall with some confusion. They weren't of Vietnam. They were of the southern portion of neighboring Laos. I remember turning to Stanley, a horrified look on my face as I realized what we'd done. "Like I told you, Gus," he simply said, nonchalantly. "Top secret." As the Green Berets loaded up, checking their rifles and smearing their faces with dark green camouflage paint, it looked like they couldn't have cared less. We've invaded a neutral nation, violated the sovereignty of a foreign government. Public opinion on the war was already against us, and I can only imagine how hostile it would become once the folks back home learned of this. But to the war-weary soldiers, borders didn't matter. Diplomacy didn't matter. To them, this was just another mission. Only, it was not just another mission. It would become the focal point in each and every one of our lives. The same Chinook that flew us in loaded up again, and its rotor's blades began to spin. Special Forces guys hauling on portable rocket launchers and cans of .50 caliber ammunition into the glowing red interior of their helicopter. Once completed, they took their seats and strapped themselves in, barking to each other as the huge aircraft's rotor blades began to spin, drowning out the sounds of the jungle with an almighty whir. The Chinook's wheels lifted off the landing pad, rising slowly above the leafy canopy in a magnificent display of human engineering. As it banked, the intense downdraft had the command center's maps flapping like the wings of a panicked bird. Stanley had to hold down a larger table map to save it from flying out of the tent. We were alone now. Alone in the command tent, with only a handful of Special Forces officers guarding the perimeter of the landing zone. Stanley kept in constant contact with the other team, talking them through their insertion into some unknown territory. I kept my mouth shut as he guided them through the mission, listening closely, trying to discern just what kind of operation this was. From what Stanley and his counterpart were saying, it was to be some sort of prisoner snatch, bagging us a Viet Cong colonel to explain us just what was so interesting to them on the Laotian soil. Stanley's acknowledgement of a period of radio silence led me to believe that the team had descended into a Viet Cong tunnel system. He paced back and forth during this period, impatiently waiting the return of radio communications. Back then, we could usually keep some kind of radio contact with our tunnel rat units. And it dawned on me that the Special Forces team must have been traversing terrain that was deep, deep underground. Yet, when the radio once again crackled into life, it was with an unexpected ferocity. Sudden gunshots and screams had me listening yet more intently as Stanley focused on every little detail.
White Feather, this is 6-1. Confirmation on target apprehension. Do you copy?
He hissed into the radio's handset. His eyes wide, white circles in the dim lights of the command tent. More screaming, more gunfire, barely audible voices crackling in the radio static.
F6. Again. Affirmative. Target. Apprehend. Over.
But the soldier on the other end didn't sound particularly victorious. The rat-tat-tat of M16s and barking of soldiers continued in the audible blizzard of radio interference.
But we need to get them out of here. Sir, I fucking know it's over. Bring that son of a bitch home, Captain. Let's get him out of here. Over and out.
I knew something was wrong when I saw the look on Stanley's face. The perennial, nauseating grin of success that would have normally been found was lacking. For the first time since I'd met him, Stanley actually looked frightened. The Chinook returned, descending slowly as the rotor blades kicked up another swirl of hot and dirt air. Yet, of the 5 Special Forces soldiers that sat there just a few hours previously, only 3 of them disembarked from the belly of the great steel beast. A pair of them held a plastic body bag, clearly full of the weight and shape of a thing. Stanley and the now bloodied captain exchanged some harsh words obscured by racket of the helicopter's engines. The soldiers carried the body bag into the command tent as I watched with terrified eyes. They looked brutalized, looks of pure horror etched into their faces as they hauled the black mass into the tent. Stanley and the captain were next. I caught a little of their conversation as they filed past me. "You left us in the fucking dark, asshole. We had no idea what the fuck we were rolling up on. This is all very unorthodox, Captain. You know that. You know the fucking risk." Fuck you, spook motherfucker. What the fuck even are those things anyway? What the fuck did I just lose 2 fucking men over, huh? What? Go take a fucking look, Captain. Go see for your fucking self. Stanley's voice cut through the rhythmic hum of the jungle like a knife. The hardened, young officer fell silent, then entered the command tent. I'll never forget what I saw in that dim lamplight. Splayed out on the map and right in front of us. It was pale. A ghostly pale. The same absence of color that I saw in Cavefish some years later. Its limbs were all twisted up and broken from bullets and rifle butts, spewing out glass noodle capillaries around jagged sections of crystalline bone. I couldn't discern any kind of face, but the only thing that could have passed for a head was lacking in orbital sockets. Only a small row of almost transparent teeth betrayed its sphincter, like a mouth. What I can only assume was its blood, a translucent, vicious soup, was plastered all over the inside of the bag. It smelled like death, like rotten fungus and decaying fish flesh. The men closest to it had to cover their faces to fend off the stench. Yet, as jostled with the burly, well-armed soldiers for a better view, I heard a scream from outside the tent. Came the cries of a woman's voice, desperate and petrified. Stanley ordered me to go check it out. One of the Green Berets, following me with his rifle held close to his chest. In the moonlight, I could make out a group of Laotian civilians stood just outside the barbed wire perimeter. They waved frantically, not even waiting for an invitation before beginning to clamber under the razor-sharp barbs of the wire fence. This had the accompanying soldier frantic, slamming around into the chamber of his rifle before his arm darted around each approaching target. He held his fire as a young woman approached, babbling something to me in Vietnamese. My knowledge of the language was pretty poor, but I knew enough to discern a few distinct words that seemed to litter each of her terrified utterances. She begged, over and over again.
Ghost.
More civilians appeared at the perimeter, mimicking their compatriots by slipping past the barbed wire and dashing into foxholes manned by machine gun-toting soldiers. They were utterly terrified. The air filled with the cries of small children clutching at their mothers in confusion. On the other side of the perimeter, more figures appeared from the thick black jungle. These figures did not appear desperate or frightened. They simply stopped at the barbed wire fence and stared blankly into the clearing. Hey! What the fuck? The soldier near me gasped. I look in horror, gripping my pistol with white knuckles, as what appeared to be hundreds of jagged, twisted silhouettes lined up in the darkness of the perimeter. The jungle behind them seemed to be seething with the presence of seemingly endless masses of broken bodies forming up before us. They glistened in the moonlight, unnatural protrusions marring from their otherwise human form. These things weren't like the other creatures on the map table. These were men, or at least, they used to be. Open fucking fire! Someone screaming in the darkness as one of the creatures threw itself over the wire. Hundreds of rounds of sickened, slipping out from a bulbous mass of bodies as it swarmed over our defenses. All I could do was empty my pistol's clip into the sea of shapes, barely making a dent in the horde as the machine guns, full of sod, ripped into them. Thrown hand grenades burst among the bodies, showering us in gore. But the tide of flesh kept approaching. They crawled, hobbled, cut down as they tried to run through the machine gun nests. Roars and retches and howls echoing throughout the clearing as the symphony of destruction was played out. There were simply too many of them. The tide of jagged bone and marked flesh washed over the foxhole after foxhole, eliciting screams of agony from the occupants as they were torn apart, ripped limb from limb by the seething mass of humanoid aberrations. The Laotian civilians tried in vain to escape the orgy of violence. but one by one they were overwhelmed, pulled down by the things that used to be men, before sharpened, protruding bone weaponry was used to shred their internal organs. We soon ran out of ammunition. The last of the machine gunners used his Leica club to fell a few of his attackers off, all before his head was torn from the shoulders with the crack of a crunch of bone and cartilage. To this day, I can't quite tell you what they were. Maybe the CIA knows by now, but I sure shit don't. But as we powered to the belly of the Chinook to make our escape, the pilot screaming and bawling to take off, I saw the thing that visits me in my deepest, darkest nightmares. Just as we lifted off the dirty jungle floor, one of the humanoid creatures leapt onto the ramp, clinging on to the bone with its clawed fingers, and then dragging itself up till its face appeared over the steel platform. I looked down at the broken corpse of a man with two faces. Two hideously misshapen sets of facial features. Somehow, blended in the creature was this grotesque mutation of its own 4 nostrils. All 4 of its eyes locked onto me, twitching and blinking as a hideous smile crept over its cracked and bleeding lips. It said something to me, something completely inaudible over the roar of the helicopter's engine. I have no idea what it tried to say, but the very idea of such a being capable of communication sent a chill through my guts. Before I even had time to react, Stanley had produced his .45 pistol and sent the thing's brains flying out the back of its skull. Its grip slacked, and with the 6th mile still etched on its maw, it fell from the helicopter to the darkness below. "Jesus Christ, look!" screamed the Special Forces captain, pointing down at the mass writhing of bodies as it swept into the command tent. The twisted humanoid figures were carrying out the bodies of the distinctly inhuman specimen, holding it aloft to their heads in some sort of horrific display of reverence. To my absolute relief, as we flew away with all the speed the great lumbering helicopter could manage, I managed to witness the sight of a pair of F-4 Phantoms dropping napalm canisters onto the overrun landing zone. Huge fumes of flames burst through the canopy, lighting up the jungle with a hellish orange glow. It was about then that I passed out, only coming around as I was carried off the Chinook by the 2 same soldiers that had carried the pale, stick-thin creature into the command tent. The site had been utterly destroyed. No one would ever know what happened there. All evidence charred to a crisp. Now, the pivotal moments of my life were little more than dust in the wind. After that, we were transferred back to stateside for debriefing. Langley made Vietnam seem like another planet again, as we sat in air-conditioned interview rooms and talked over everything we'd seen in absolute detail. I told my superiors everything except the man with 2 faces. The entire time I expected the 2 interviewers to balk and scoff at him. Frankly, these were ridiculous things that I was saying. But interestingly enough, they didn't. It was like they knew all of this already. I never saw Stanley ever again. Shortly after, I handed in my separation papers to my new boss. Some pencil-pushing academic who clearly never fired a weapon in anger. He looked fresh, no signs of the haunted consciousness that was visible in his eyes of Stanley or the mysterious Special Forces captain. I'm going to go tuck my grandson into bed, then polish off that bottle before I try to sleep tonight. I might even open a fresh one to really sink into oblivion. Once again, the idea of dreaming terrifies me. For the first time in 37 years, I'm afraid to close my eyes. But I'm not afraid to see the man with 2 faces. I'm afraid to see what made him.